Well, welcome everybody to the Tower Center Monthly Seminar. This is an opportunity to expose you to some of the great work being done by Tower Center fellows, associates, and friends. Today we have a very special treat. We have Paul Avey, who's recently joined us at the center as the Tower Postdoctoral Fellow. Paul's last deployment was at MIT as the Stanton Nuclear Fellow in the Security Studies program there. Before then, he received a PhD. His PhD was in this field, in nuclear strategy in general. You can see his full bio on this sheet as well. Paul's going to speak today for about, 32 to 35 minutes?
And then I'm told the cane comes out after that.
32 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Paul Avey.
Thank you, Josh, for that very kind introduction. Very happy to be here today. I feel like this is sort of the last step of my Tower Center initiation. Afterwards, Jim and Josh are going to take me out and show me the secret handshake, and I'll be a full member of the community.
There you go.
So what I will be talking about for 32 to 35 minutes is a little bit of a book project that I'm working on, which looks at conflict between countries that have nuclear weapons and countries that don't have nuclear weapons. And this sort of conflict is puzzling to me for a number of different reasons. All right, to begin with, the basic deterrence literature says when only one side in a conflict has these weapons, you should get some political leverage out of it. After all, the non-nuclear side can't threaten retaliation in kind, right? So it can't deter a nuclear strike. It's in these situations, more than anywhere else, that the absolute weapon should buy you some influence. There's also a broader literature in international relations that says power preponderance causes peace. And the basic logic here is, when it's obvious one side is much, much stronger than the other and can inflict greater harm, then the weaker side will just make a concession to avoid having to pay the costs of fighting and then making the concession anyway. When we look at it in history, we see at least a dozen wars between nuclear and non-nuclear states, hundreds of crises, and it's often the non-nuclear side that's starting the trouble, depending on what conflict data set you want to use from political science, between 41 and 56% of the time. Right, so about half the time. And the question we have to ask is why? Why does little David here not care about this giant spear in Goliath's hand and go ahead and throw the rock anyway? And that's really the question that's motivating this research project. Why do non-nuclear states challenge and resist nuclear-armed opponents? What I'm going to argue is they're most likely to do this when there's a danger to their core interests, the non-nuclear side's core interests. And then once they make the decision to act, they're going to engage in some sort of hedging behavior, essentially self-imposing red lines on their own actions and gambling that if they behave this way, it's going to reduce the odds nuclear weapons get used. And I'll unpack this all much more as I go along today. Now, this is an important issue for a number of different reasons. First, for better or worse, nuclear weapons aren't going away anytime soon. Right, there's a lot of countries that have these, some other countries probably trying to get them, which means there's a lot of potential conflict out there between nuclear and non-nuclear states. And it's important to understand how these are likely to play out to try to minimize the risks for nuclear use in world politics. There are also issues for U.S. foreign policy, or U.S. policy in general. The United States is currently spending a lot of money modernizing its nuclear arsenal. What kind of return on investment is this likely to get? What kind of leverage can you or can you not expect against non-nuclear states? Also, issues of counterproliferation. Right? How concerned should the United States be about regional proliferation that creates new regional asymmetries? Right? How dangerous is this likely to be? And despite the fact that I think this is an important issue and one that's a puzzle, it really hasn't received a lot of attention. So you go back during the Cold War, not surprisingly, the focus is on U.S.-Soviet Union mutually assured destruction. After the Cold War, literature is focused first and foremost, and I think still to this day, on proliferation. Why do countries want these weapons? How can the international community stop them from getting these weapons? Very, very recently, some attention to the politics of what I would call unbalanced nuclear relationships, and I put some of the scholarship on the overhead here. But these studies don't get at the heart of what I'm asking, which is why is the non-nuclear state behaving the way it is? Now, the normative explanation does offer at least a partial answer here. And the basic logic is in two steps. First, over time, norms arose around nuclear weapons that told state leaders these are bad. You really can't use these in just about any situation. They then extend this argument to say non-nuclear state leaders figured this game out, right? They realized there's these norms, They don't take the nuclear threat seriously as a result, so they feel free to challenge and resist the nuclear-armed opponent. Now, I think Tannenwald, Paul, some others have done a good job showing that norms influence the nuclear state decision-making. What they really haven't done yet is show that the non-nuclear state actually buys this. Right? And in an article that I recently resubmitted, hopefully forthcoming soon, I take a look at this and look at several of their key cases and say there's just not a lot of evidence that they think that way. Now, I won't talk a lot more about that today during the talk, but I'm happy to do so during Q&A if there's interest. What I will do for the rest of the talk today is outline my own argument in more detail. Talk a little bit about research design. Josh knows I'm a methods maven guy, so I have to at least talk a little bit about how I know if I'm right on these things. I'll outline two cases that I use. I look at several, but I'll focus here on the Soviet decision to blockade Berlin in 1948, and then the Iraqi decision to go ahead and fight the United States in 1991. And finally, I'll conclude briefly with some implications for nuclear deterrence and nuclear proliferation. So just to restate the main argument one more time, get us all back there. Non-nuclear states most likely to challenge or resist the nuclear opponent when there's a danger to their core interests. Then they'll engage in a hedging procedure to minimize the risk nuclear weapons get used. So we can diagram the argument in simple causal arrow diagram here. Some sort of danger causes action, then a hedging behavior, limiting options, finally the type of assertive policy we see. So the dependent variable here in this study is assertive policy. And I'm just defining that as challenging and resisting the nuclear-armed opponent. In bargaining terms, we can think of this as sort of an unwillingness to concede on an issue. Right? Either you don't give in to a demand or you make a demand and don't take no for an answer. The independent variable is this danger to core interests. And here I start with the observation that nuclear weapons do nothing to solve political disputes between states. Right? If two countries have a problem before one side gets a nuclear weapon, that problem doesn't magically disappear overnight because one of them got a nuclear weapon. Right? What it does do is raise the potential costs for the non-nuclear state of getting into a fight. These are, after all, very destructive weapons. They can visit that destruction in a short amount of time. There's no real defense against them. So I expect the non-nuclear state to be most willing to incur these potential costs when there's a core issue at stake. Right? And by core interests here, I just mean the ability for the non-nuclear side to provide security, to organize its domestic and foreign policy as it sees fit. In other words, security for political autonomy, sort of a basic international relations argument. And a couple logics underpin this. First, from strategic studies, we know that states are willing to take greater risks when they think the situation is only going to get worse in the future, which you lose the ability to provide security. That's a worse future. Right? The intuition here is, yeah, it's not great to challenge the nuclear state today, but if we wait and do nothing, we may be unable to act at all. So we have to do something today. From psychology, there's a very large literature that shows individuals are more willing to take long-shot gambles when they face or in the process of facing major losses. In technical terms, they're in the domain of losses. And I argue most leaders, most of the time, frame a threat or a danger to their core interests as being in the domain of losses. Still, to borrow from the Prussian Otto von Bismarck, I always go back to Germany whenever I need to learn about warfare or anything. Isn't this sort of risk-taking behavior a little bit like committing suicide for fear of death? You're taking some risk now because you're worried about some risk in the future. So to understand how the non-nuclear state deals with this, it's necessary to turn to this process part of the argument. I deliberately call this a process because this is about how the non-nuclear state acts rather than whether it's going to act or not. So it's not a separate independent variable. The basic claim here is they're going to act, limit their own behavior, essentially self-impose red lines on their behavior, and gamble that as long as they behave this way, it's going to minimize the odds the nuclear state's going to use its weapons. And this is a reasonable bet to make in strategic nuclear monopoly when only one side has these weapons. It's a reasonable bet for a couple different reasons. First, by definition, the non-nuclear side doesn't have nuclear weapons, right? Can't use these to threaten the nuclear state's arsenal, no counterforce strikes. Can't use them to threaten the nuclear state's cities, no counter-value strikes here. This removes a lot of military incentives for the nuclear side to use its weapons right away. It doesn't fear the destruction of its arsenal, destruction of its cities, so it doesn't have this use it or lose it problem, where it has to fire now for the fear that it won't be able to fire tomorrow, where it has to fire now because its cities are going to be destroyed unless it does so. Lower military incentives. Also, this reduces pressure on command and control, which reduces the risks for accidental or inadvertent nuclear use. Because there's these lower military needs to use these things, there's a lot of external strategic and military reasons, constraints against using nuclear weapons that can come into play. Right? Nuclear states may not want to use weapons that destroy valuable resources, territory, and people they have an interest in. Why blow up the city with a nuclear weapon if you don't have to? Unless there's a military or a strategic necessity to do so. States can fear demonstration effects. Right? They use these weapons, they worry other actors in international politics are going to see this, decide these are useful, we should either get them or now we can use them. This will blow back against the strategic interests of the nuclear state. The point is, not strong military incentives to use them and a lot of external constraints against their use. So that opens a space, an opportunity for the non-nuclear side to act. But how big that state is, or space is and how much they have, or how much latitude they have to act, depends in large part on the conventional balance. So we've got to talk about the conventional balance a little bit as well. And the claim here is that all else equal, the stronger the non-nuclear side is conventionally, the more it's going to have to restrain its behavior, the greater it's going to have to hedge. There's a couple reasons here. First and most importantly, stronger non-nuclear states, right, they can reintroduce a lot of these military and strategic reasons for the nuclear state to use its weapons. Nuclear states facing a big conventional defeat, big loss, it's going to say, well, we can worry about these demonstration effects tomorrow. We don't want to suffer a major conventional defeat. We're going to use these weapons now. In addition, very powerful conventional adversaries can actually take out nuclear forces with simply conventional arms. Right? This can reintroduce use it or lose it dynamics. Again, create these military incentives that trump the external constraints acting on this. In addition, it's really tough for very powerful conventional states to signal limited intentions and have it be believed. Right? So a weak state can come along and say, we're just going to contest you on this limited issue, and we're not going to do much more. And it's credible because they can't do much more. Right? But a strong state has an incentive to lie here, has an incentive to bluff. Say, we're only going to contest you on this issue, please don't nuke us, but lie and then push further. Right? That means they have to behave much more cautiously when they're confronting a nuclear opponent as a result of this. Now, I think of restraint as sort of three ideal type categories. In reality, it's a continuum, but for analytical purposes, I simply call it high, modest, or low. Pretty simple. High restraint, very limited aims and means the non-nuclear state will do, will take care not to allow an actual shooting war to fight or to happen. If it looks like conflict's going to happen, they will make a concession and back down. It's too risky to actually get in a fight. Modest, now you're willing to actually push a little harder, you're willing to get into a shooting war, you're still going to limit your aims and your means, maybe because you have to or maybe because you choose to. The point is you're fighting over some limited issue, and you're going to try to seek outside actors to sort of hedge further, either directly or indirectly constrain the nuclear opponent. Low hedging here, similar, you're still going to fight, but you're foregoing either limiting your aims or your means, or you're foregoing seeking outside support. Or you give up one of those. So the argument makes a number of predictions. I want to talk about two today, two most important ones. All right, if this argument's right, we should see non-nuclear states acting when there's a danger to core interests. And we should also see them hedging to try to minimize the risks for nuclear strikes. And the stronger they are relative to the nuclear state, the greater they should be hedging. They have to do it. Non-nuclear states that are weak have a lot more latitude. They can push further if they want to, but they can also, if they decide, still act restrained. So how do I know if I'm right? How do I measure some of these things? Dependent variable, assertive behavior. I look at a few different indicators here. So first, I just look at a list of crises and wars. The intuition here is the non-nuclear state was behaving somewhat assertively because it didn't back down, and we see a crisis or war occurring. If it was behaving non-assertively, it would have made a concession and we wouldn't see this. I also look, to avoid just looking at crisis and war, look at the periods of diplomatic engagement, sort of the reverse or diplomatic friction. More engaging, less assertive behavior. Measure dangers to core interests with a few different ways. First and foremost, right, I look at private leader statements. What were the leaders saying among themselves as what are their core interests? And importantly, this has to be consistent over time. Okay, they can't just at the moment of crisis say, this is our interest now, we're going to fight over it. It has to be a long period of time before, after, in order to avoid just post hoc justifications here. I also look at some basic data on underlying military and economic trends. Is it reasonable for an outside observer to say, yeah, there was a danger here, just given it's reasonable for someone to perceive this? And was it moving in the wrong direction? And finally, I look then do the leaders actually justify these sorts of dangers as the reasons they were acting? Talking about this hedging issue requires me to do a couple different things. First, it's going to require some basic net assessment. Balance of the conventional capability indicators, look at the relative economic size, military forces, how big is the Army, the Navy, etc. What's the quality of these troops, right? You have a big army, but they're poorly led, they have outdated equipment, it's not as big of a problem. It's a basic geography, right? What kind of danger can they actually pose to the nuclear state? If they take territory, can that fundamentally alter the balance of power in the world? That's going to be a bigger threat if they can do that. Then to get at sort of how much they've hedged, what category they're in, again, rely a lot on private leader statements. Right? First and foremost, were they actually talking about the nuclear state's arsenal? Did they say, yeah, they have one and they might use it under these situations, but they're unlikely to use it under these situations? Right? Were they cognizant of these things? Were these in the discussions? Bless you. Did they have any plans to actually prosecute a military campaign? Or were they going to say, you know what, if this doesn't work, we're going to back down? Did they behave that way? If they did have war plans, were those war plans in fact limited aims? And did they limit the means they were going to use in those situations? It can't be that they planned for a massive war, somehow got bogged down fighting a small one. That's not evidence for my argument. It has to be a plan for a limited war. Was this over a discrete issue? Something that plausibly could be communicated to the nuclear state, we're going to test this but not push further. It won't automatically lead to additional demands. Primarily use case analysis here, case studies. I look at cases over a long period of time. This is important. We have to have variation on the independent and dependent variable in political science. This allows me to get this, right? Because there's periods of non-confrontation between these states, then a period of confrontation, then non-confrontation. So if my argument's right, we should see changes in that independent variable corresponding to changes in the dependent variable, the confrontational period. We can also look at changes in basic military balance. Does that lead in changes in behavior over these periods? Cross-case analysis is useful here as well. Do strong non-nuclear states consistently hedge more than weaker non-nuclear states? So I look at 4 cases in detail in the project, and I've listed them here. Egypt should actually say till 1979. I go all the way through the peace process. Those are those. And then I look at the universe of wars versus non-nuclear states, both to see if the argument generalizes to essentially cases of extreme values in the dependent variable. The non-nuclear side is behaving pretty assertively if you get a war. Either they were willing to fight and they wouldn't back down, or they made so many demands that they ended up in a shooting war. This also lets me see a few other things, but I'm happy to talk about that Q&A while I look at these. How do I code this? Wherever possible, I rely on primary source documents. Right? So for the Soviet case, the Chinese case, Cold War International History Project is very, very valuable here. Some cases you couldn't get access, or I couldn't get access to documents that the leadership actually had, like Egypt. We still don't have access to those. What I could do, though, is look at what were Egyptian leaders saying to Western leaders. Right? So I could go look and see what was the Egyptian National Security Advisor telling Henry Kissinger in secret meetings. Were they talking about the Israeli nuclear arsenal? How did they think about it? You can look at it that way. I also conducted archival research at the Conflict Records Research Center in Washington, D.C. This is where the United States houses the captured documents from Iraq, 2003. This is an invaluable resource in gaining insight into Saddam's decision-making. I won't call it strategic, but decision-making. I supplement these with secondary sources, both to get a broader context, and then sometimes I couldn't get access to a document, they were able to. I can see what's being said there. And finally, indicators on basic national capabilities, GDP, army size, etc., from a variety of data sources. Said at the beginning, I'll talk about 2 cases today: Soviet blockade of Berlin and the Iraqi decision to fight the United States in 1990, 1991. And I'll start with the Soviet case. What I'm going to argue is, before 1948, there's a low danger to Soviet core interests. This changes with U.S. policy in Germany. At the same time, the Soviets are a pretty strong conventional power at this point. So the argument predicts they're going to behave relatively passively before 1948, they become more assertive in 1948, but because they're so strong, they should impose strong restraints on their behavior, and the likely outcome is we'll only see a crisis. And that is, in fact, what we see. So, Soviet core interests. All right, basic interests here: defense in depth in Eastern Europe, some role in Germany. Not noble, but predictable given Russian and Soviet experiences in World War I and World War II. All right, this is pretty famous. The West is willing to go along with this for the most part. Churchill goes to Moscow in 1944 and writes this down, right? Romania, Russia will get 90% influence. Greece, Great Britain will get 90% influence. Divides up Eastern Europe. Hands the document to Stalin. Stalin says, all right, puts the check mark at the top, gives it back to Churchill and says, yep, we're good. Right? Europe's divided, great power politics, 1944. Now, the Americans weren't at this meeting, but as I show elsewhere and other scholars have shown, the Americans are pretty willing to give the Soviets a relatively free hand in Eastern Europe. So for the Soviets, if you're not being challenged here, it's not worth fighting the only nuclear power in the world. And we see time after time during the early post-war period, the Soviets just back down. Right? So there's concern over Soviet troops in Iran after the World War II. U.S. protests, the Soviets back down. Rather than entangling with the British and the Americans in Greece, the Civil War, Stalin just cuts off support to the Soviet communists. So they want a voice in Japanese and Italian occupation. The U.S. says no. They basically drop the issue. It's not worth fighting over these things. One big problem, though, that is unsolved is Germany. Right? Germany, after the war, divided into 4 occupation zones. Britain, America, France in the west, and the Soviets in the east. Berlin, divided into these same zones, but deep inside Soviet territory. So the West has access rights here, but has to cross Soviet ground to get there. Now, Germany's a big Soviet concern for a number of different reasons. Obviously, they invaded them twice, or at least Russia and then the Soviet Union. A lot of damage. And even more than it's clear to both sides, the Americans and the Soviets, if Germany's rebuilt, reunified, allied with one side or the other, can fundamentally alter the balance of power in world politics. Right, so the Soviets are very consistent on this point. Stalin's running around this entire period telling anybody who will listen just how dangerous a rebuilt, unified Germany tied to the West will be. Molotov, the foreign minister in 1948, says bluntly, if we lose Germany, we lost the last war. This is exactly what seems to be happening in the spring of 1948. The U.S., the British, and the French are tired of Soviet actions. They say, we're going to go our own way. They start forming essentially a West German state. Soviets get wind of this, come to the Americans and say, you do this, we're going to have a big problem. The Americans did. How far are they going to go? Well, the Soviets are pretty conventionally powerful here. This is just some basic data on defense spending and troop numbers. Basically, their troops very quickly came to be about at least 2-to-1 to the United States. They started spending more money on defense than the United States. And this is not the Soviet army of the late Cold War. This is a good fighting force. This is the army that just beat the Wehrmacht. Right? It has good leaders, has good equipment for the time. It's well tested. Right? This is a good fighting force. Western Europe is universally recognized as vulnerable. Most of the estimates said 6 to 8 weeks the Soviets could conquer Western Europe. The Americans could not put up a conventional fight at this point. It was clear that if the Soviets did that, they could integrate the Western European economy. Global balance of power could shift here. All right, the Americans were very, very nervous about this. Stalin was aware, given this balance, what the U.S.'s war plan would be. He had spies in America and Britain. He knew the war plans called for an atomic blitz on Soviet cities in the event of this kind of war. All right, the U.S. sort of subtly encouraged this thinking, dropping hints every once in a while that they had the bomb and the Soviets didn't. In addition, during the Berlin crisis itself, they dispatched B-29s to Britain. Now, the ones they dispatched, I want to be clear on this, did not actually have nuclear weapons with them, but it was the same class of aircraft used to bomb Japan. So it's another sort of reminder, we have these things. And Stalin had his spies telling him the same thing. So the argument says, right, the Soviets have to behave assertively, but they're going to work very, very hard to prevent this from escalating to a war. And that's what we see with their behavior during the Berlin blockade. Right? The location itself, deep inside the Soviet zone, they don't have to cross frontiers. All they have to do is close off access points. It's a defensive move. There's a very cautious lead up to this. There's no big military preparations. The West takes note of this. They don't simply institute the blockade overnight on June 24th. They harass Western transports, Western supply routes for a while, want to see what the U.S. response is going to be. They don't find a vigorous response, so they decide they can push a little bit further. During the course of the blockade, they didn't really behave nearly as aggressively as they could have. They never actually interfered with the airlift that much. And in fact, Soviet air traffic controllers still went to work and helped guide in the very planes undermining the blockade. And they didn't completely cut off the western zones of Berlin from the eastern zones of Berlin, which meant supplies did come in that way as well, which greatly facilitated the airlift. A lot of arguments say that if they had cut that off entirely, the airlift could not by itself have supplied the city. Most importantly, they ultimately conceded the issue. It's clear the goal is not going to be met. The U.S. is going to go forward with this West German state. Rather than escalating and fighting, The Soviets back down and suffer a major political defeat. So just to summarize, right, before 1948, low danger to core interests, Germany, Eastern Europe not threatened, Soviets behave relatively passively. This changes, Soviets behave more assertively, but given the conventional balance at the time, they're greatly restrained in how they act. And they took American nuclear weapons into consideration when they did that. What about the other end of the Cold War? All right, 45 years of non-use. Everybody should know these things aren't going to be used at this point. All right, here I want to talk a little bit about Iraq, and I'm just going to focus here on the actual decision to get into a confrontation with Kuwait and the United States. What I'll argue is the Iraqis perceived a high danger to their core interests in 1990. They had very low capabilities relative to the United States at this point. They had a big army, but it was with older equipment. It was bruised from the war with Iran, needed new supplies, and they had no way of actually getting it to attack the United States directly. So what the argument predicts is the Iraqis will be willing to get into a fight, maybe even a war with the United States, but they should still limit their behavior in some way. And it looks now like they did take chemical weapons off the table as a result of the American nuclear arsenal. So Iraq at the end of the 1980s is in a lot of trouble. All right? Per capita GDP has tanked. This is the result of a decade's war with Iran. They lack the capital to invest in oil infrastructure to pump their way out of this crisis. More ominously, they start looking out at U.S. economic and military activity in the region, and they become convinced there's some sort of U.S. plan to destabilize their regime. All right, they're convinced the U.S. is working with Kuwait and other Saudi and other Gulf actors to depress oil prices to keep them weak. They're also taking notice of visits by U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf and others to Kuwait. They say this shows there's going to be an alliance at some point in the future. We're going to have a very strong America on our doorstep, and we're going to be in a very bad position to deal with this problem. So we need to do something about it. And in this environment, sometime in the spring of 1990, Kuwait emerges as sort of a cure-all here. You disrupt the American plans, or what you perceive as the American plans, and at the same time, you get access to a lot of oil. This will allow you to prop up your regime, rebuild your army, fend off any advances. Now, I think it's important, I want to spend a minute here talking. The Iraqis were aware from the beginning the U.S. would oppose this invasion in some way. Right? So the story is of the green light is U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie sits down with Saddam Hussein on July 25th, 1990, says the U.S. won't take a position on this. And Saddam Hussein interprets that as the U.S. says go ahead and invade Kuwait. I don't think that's really a tenable interpretation for a number of different reasons. First, that was not the only meeting between Iraqi and U.S. officials. And other U.S. officials made it clear the U.S. would take a position on this. In addition, military intelligence that day and other days was making it clear the U.S. would oppose an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And their intelligence often didn't stray far from the political line. So this is probably what the elites thought. Finally, they took this whole collusion thing between the U.S. and Kuwait seriously. So it doesn't make sense that the U.S. would suddenly abandon its ally at the first sense of trouble. So they knew this would be some sort of action against the United States. Was probably hoping it wouldn't be a war. It was also clear Iraq was relatively weak to the compared to the United States. Right? I talked about it. I won't go into a lot of detail. Their army was big. It was older equipment, not as well organized, could not strike the U.S. Even very doubtful that they could conquer, all the oil reserves, even with a small U.S. force in the area. Could have probably prevented that. So they couldn't fundamentally change the balance of power in world politics. So they could push pretty far because they posed a low threat to the U.S. Certainly couldn't affect the U.S. nuclear arsenal in any way. Argument predicts they'll do something and they might be willing to fight a war. This is eventually, of course, what happens. They didn't want to fight a war. The initial strategy was just take Kuwait really, really quickly, present the U.S. with a fait accompli, and then try to bog them down through negotiations, get international support on their side. This didn't work. But they remained committed. They say, we're not giving up. We're going to fight. And we know now that they took the U.S. nuclear arsenal into consideration here. All right? There's a lot of meetings where they were sitting around, Saddam and his lieutenants, talking about U.S. nuclear capabilities. What are the situations in which they might use these? All right? Private conversations. Not just cheap talk either, not them trying to bolster themselves to feel good. Military preparations. It appears they deployed some of their forces based on readings of American nuclear capabilities. They engaged civil defense measures. Right? They actually at one point modeled what a 20-kiloton atomic explosion on Baghdad would look like. I don't know why they picked that yield, but that's what they were modeling. And there was a lot of concern about how do we get civilians out of the city. They actually practiced a few evacuations right? What's now Sadr City, they had this big drill where they forced people to leave the city. How would we evacuate these people? This was not done to bolster the Iraqi morale, right? They were very concerned this was damaging Iraqi morale because the Iraqi people are like, oh my God, they're going to nuke us? Why are we doing this? But they said, all right, we'll dial back the rhetoric, but we're staying committed here. They did, however, limit the means they would fight this war. So they're going to fight defensively, but more importantly, they're not going to use their chemical arsenal. Partially, this was a belief that it could deter U.S. nuclear use, the sort of the poor man's atomic bomb argument here. But it was also, as Tariq Aziz pointed out, Saddam's longtime confidant and foreign minister at this point, said if we use these things, the Americans will probably retaliate with a nuclear strike at a meeting in the fall of 1990. All right? So they didn't use every weapon in their arsenal. This happened before Secretary of State James Baker went there and sort of implied, don't do this or we may use nuclear weapons. Right? This is a self-imposition. They ignored the other warnings he did. They thought this is what the Americans would really set the Americans off, so they didn't do it. Okay, so high danger to core interests. The Iraqis do something. They're willing to fight the United States when push comes to shove. Right? They sort of engage in a low hedging option here. Contrast this with the Soviet Union here. Much, much less restrained. They're willing to fight, but they still limit their means a little bit. So just to sort of beat you guys over the head with this, the main claim one more time. Most likely to act, danger to core interests, and some sort of hedging procedure to minimize the odds nuclear weapons get used. I want to close then with just a couple implications for deterrence and proliferation. So these weapons, at least in these asymmetric nuclear monopoly situations, they have a subtle influence on behavior. You'll still see conflict, not going to give a ton of leverage to the nuclear state, but they do influence when and the ways in which non-nuclear states act. I also think it's important to point out how this plays out is determined in part by the conventional balance. Right? So we need to take the conventional balance into consideration when we're modeling or thinking about these things. This may seem like an obvious point, but you go out and read the nuclear literature and then other deterrence literature, and it's like ne'er the two shall meet. All right? A lot of times the conventional balance just isn't taken seriously, or it's thrown as a control variable. It's never thought of as how this might influence decision making. Building off of that, I think it does point to a way the nuclear states can increase the leverage they get from their arsenal, and that's reduce their conventional strength. Tie their own hands, make the non-nuclear side stronger relative to them. Right? This is going to force them to act in a more restrained way. Having said that, I don't think you get enough leverage to justify tying your hands in this way, to giving up all the conventional options. So if I were speaking to U.S. policymakers, I would not make that actual recommendation. Stay with the conventional options. You get a lot more flexibility with it. There are these external constraints that will impose real costs if you have to use these weapons. What about proliferation? Well, one of the big concerns in the debate over Iran, other countries, and a couple years ago now, at this point, the late Kenneth Wallace and Matt Koenig is still making this argument. One of the concerns is Iran gets a weapon, it's going to be the regional nuclear hegemon, right? All of its neighbors are going to have to bow down, do whatever it wants. The argument that I put forth here qualifies that pretty heavily. Yes, you get some political leverage, but you start actually threatening key issues for these non-nuclear states, they're going to resist. Right? They may even fight a war with you. You're not just going to be able to run roughshod over the whole region. This isn't to say proliferation's good. I'm not doing the Ken Waltz give everybody a bomb here. There's a lot of other consequences, right? There's issues of loose nukes. There's issues of, it certainly decreases the U.S. freedom of action, U.S. ability to project power, if that's something you care about. More accidents. So a number of reasons to be concerned. But when you're putting this in the ledger sheet of why should we be worried about this, this whole regional nuclear hegemon issue should not be a main concern. Okay, with that, 32 and a half minutes. I believe I was right on. Yeah. Thank you. I will stop talking, and I look forward to your guys' questions. If I can have a sheet of paper, actually.
That was really impressive. Right on them.
It's just some fancy new computers.
We will open it up for questions, please.
So I'm interested in, right now your dependent variable is sort of aggression.
Assertive behavior is the
aggressive behavior.
Yeah.
Or assertive behavior. I'm wondering if there's a meaningful difference between assertive behavior sort of on the offensive versus assertive behavior on the defensive, that sort of like, you know, if you're moving, if you're the first mover, that's one thing, but perhaps if you're in a position to respond to the action of a nuclear-armed state, you may end up being more assertive than you would like to be in order to sort of save face domestically or regionally, or something like that. This is like that there may be a sort of meaningful distinction between whether you're the first mover or the responder.
Right. So that's an excellent point. I actually hadn't thought before, so I'm going to have to work out the implications of the behaving more assertively for defensive purposes to save face. So that's a point well taken. I can speak a little bit more broadly to the whole why don't I have aggressive versus defensive sort of actions here as this. A number of different reasons. Sort of theoretically, I think the argument works whether they're behaving offensively or defensively. So I don't want to artificially truncate the universe of cases that I'm talking about. I also think, whether you're thinking offensively or defensively, in both cases, there's some sort of bargaining failure here, which means weapons should be in play. These should be influencing decisions in some way. So there's theoretical reasons to not put those into two separate categories. There's also real practical reasons here. Assigning whether an action is sort of assertive offensively or assertive defensively is very, very difficult in practice. Who started the Cuban Missile Crisis? Right, is the example I always give. This is one of the things we know the most about. Was it the Soviets or was it the United States? I can tell you a very good story that it was the Soviets, and I think most Americans would say, of course, it was the commie bastards that started this thing. Right? They put missiles where we said that they shouldn't. So it's the Soviets behaving offensively here. At the same time, we know the U.S. had nuclear weapons on their doorstep, and there's no crisis over that. So how assertive was this behavior? Soviets probably had some defensive reasoning in mind. They wanted to protect Cuba. That's a defensive goal. They put the missiles in place before the Americans. Kennedy in September said his sort of red line speech about not doing this. And it was the United States that, when it discovered these missiles, actually started the crisis by putting the blockade in place. Right? The Soviets don't put in a blockade, no crisis in Turkey, but the Americans do. There's a crisis over here. So parsing out which side's acting aggressively or defensively, I looked at it and, sort of honest, it just got way too. You ran yourself into circles. It was really, really difficult to try to do that, and because there was theoretical reasons not to worry about that as much, I decided to save myself a little bit of the headache there. However, the saving face issue is a good one, and I will certainly think more about that.
Well, it is a good book, because in your definition you said that instigating something was either challenging or resistant.
Yes.
You put that in the same sentence, but those strike me as different things. Like a challenge would be a proactive step that you take against another power. Resistance means that somebody's already aggressed against you and you're resisting that aggression.
Right.
I think that's sort of
right. And so you might not want to start a fight, but you might not want to look weak if someone else starts the fight. You don't want to just sit there and sort of get punched in the face. You want to punch back.
Right. So again, in both cases, if you think about it, I hate going into bargaining. There's a bargaining breakdown in both cases, right? And so, in both cases, there's some sort of failure to find a politically acceptable solution. As a result of that, there's some sort of conflict that occurs. I don't know if it's worth. I will think more about it, but I don't know if it's worth trying to parse that out too much, because I think theoretically, nuclear weapons are on the table in both situations. So they should be entering the non-nuclear state decision-making in both situations. The non-nuclear state will judge or alter its behavior accordingly in both situations. So if I can explain both situations with one logic, it's so it's a little bit more parsimonious that way. So that's my defense on that. Excellent. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not asking. That's right.
And if you have other questions, please just raise your hand. I'll keep the queue. Sir.
This is really not exactly an academic question, but it ties in a little bit. Isn't having nuclear capability sort of a country's way of saying I've joined an elite club that, in effect, by joining that club, has set up a red line that makes other countries much more careful in what they do. I'm thinking specifically of North Korea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we think that Japan doesn't have nuclear capability. We're not sure that South Korea doesn't have it. China says maybe. So, but none of them see, and they could overwhelm that country easily. But Korea still fires missiles, does things, and doesn't seem to it doesn't seem that countries have organized themselves to even test a red line or a conflict scenario that goes down. Just
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you, right? That part of getting nuclear weapons is essentially giving your country a deterrent capability that, you know, don't push us too far or we have these things, right? And so part of the reason North Korea may have them is maybe to gain attention, maybe an actual deterrent. Right? Certainly in a tough neighborhood, they have the United States right next door that has historically had tough relations. I'm not saying the U.S. has any demands on North Korea. I don't think the U.S. is planning to invade North Korea. But there's a strategic logic that you can make for why North Korea has these things.
Think the Ukrainians regret giving them?
The Ukrainians may regret giving them up, right? Yeah, no. But in terms of why aren't these neighbors pushing North Korea because they have these things, I wouldn't call sort of, you know, launching a Taepodong missile into the Sea of Japan really a danger to Japanese or South Korean core interests. These are minor level issues. It's not worth confronting North Korea, in the framework of my argument, not worth confronting North Korea over these issues. This would have to be a much bigger issue, essentially them coming across the DMZ before you see a bigger, or completely cutting off the islands, I forget the name of the islands, off the west coast of Korea that the North Koreans interdict the shipping and passengers every once in a while. Completely cutting that off or trying to occupy that. Something much, much larger before the non-nuclear states in the area would start trying to test the red lines of North Korea. Now, more broadly here, outside of the framework of my argument, the U.S. is a player here as well. China is a player here as well. China would probably try to constrain North Korea, I'm guessing. And the U.S. could make very, very clear to North Korea if they were involved in a conflict, if you were to use these weapons in any way, guess what? We have them as well. At the very least, you're getting regime change. At most, Pyongyang is gone.
Yeah, my question is, what's going on in hedging stage? And I asked this question because you explained about your dependent variable is, that is an assertive policy, and also what kind of danger there is. And then you talk about what core interest means. But at the same time, it seems to me that at hedging process, many things are going on, and then that's actually kind of bargaining. And then you said this is a kind of the use of the non-nuclear states initiation of crisis or assertive policy is result of the bargaining failure. So my kind of hypothesis is, based on what you said, is at the hedging process, the non-nuclear state tries to lower the process, lower the probability of nuclear states' use of nuclear weapons. And then, if that is successful, then the non-nuclear state will initiate the assertive policy. That's kind of like I'm setting hypothesis. I'm not like making a conclusion or argument, but that's actually my hypothesis. How do you think? Like, it seems that the non-nuclear state is trying to lower the possibility of nuclear states' use of nuclear weapon, and then as a result, if that is successful, then like a non-nuclear state may be more likely to initiate assertive policy.
So I completely agree with you for the first half of everything, of the hypothesis statement. That's exactly my argument. That what they're trying to do by setting these red lines, by hedging, by trying to get external support, is minimizing the odds for a nuclear strike. I think where I sort of part company with you a little bit is that that's what they're sort of planning before and during the action stage, but it's not something that then causes them to act. All right, they have to do this in a way, and they're going to carry out their actions in this way because this is what they're gambling. Ultimately, they can't know what the nuclear threshold is for the nuclear state. They can guess. They can have some reasonable ideas of what would cause the nuclear side to use these weapons. Right? Iraq was guessing that it was going to be chemical weapons was going to be the thing that would set the United States off, but not burning the oil fields. So they pushed, but they had already decided to act at that point, and they had built that into their plans of how they were going to act. So I guess that's how I'm conceptualizing it. I don't know if that's a full answer. I mean, I completely agree with a lot of what you're saying.
What I'm saying is, it seems like this is kind of rational gambling. And then, I think that the difference between what you said and what I said is kind of whether it should still be called gambling.
Okay.
So what I was trying to hypothesize is it may be it now reaches the level of not being called gambling.
Because they've lowered it so far. I think the threshold, my sort of, back to John Mearsheimer, there's 100, you can never be fully certain of intentions out there. So that's where I run back to on that.
Sir, please.
Oh, sorry.
Are we witnessing in Iran a situation of hedging their bets? For example, they say that they are not interested in having nuclear weapons. However, at the same time, several have said in Iran that they need to have it for several reasons. One, defense against Pakistan or other unstable neighbors, or two, a matter of pride, as someone else mentioned. Are we seeing this situation developing there, just a hedge?
So, I can't claim to be an expert on Iran. I don't know, ultimately, if they're trying to get nuclear weapons, or if the Supreme Leader's statement that these are not weapons for Iran, for other Islamic countries to have. If that's serious, I don't know. My guess would be that there is, or not my guess, but I think there is a compelling strategic logic. I think it complicates U.S. policy in the region, certainly. But if I were in Tehran, I could make a pretty compelling case why these weapons would be useful. You have Pakistan conventionally on one side of you that has nuclear weapons as well. You have the superpower in the world whose publicly stated goal is regime change. You look out and you see what regimes have had regime change happen to them at the hands of the United States in the last 15 years. Which ones haven't? It doesn't take too much looking to realize North Korea is still there. Libya gave up its program. They're not there anymore. Iraq doesn't have one. They're not there anymore. So that would be, I could make a very compelling strategic argument for why they would have an interest in one. That would be a little bit different than the sort of hedging that I'm talking about here. This would be as if they actually got into a serious crisis with the United States tomorrow, and they were willing to fight. How would they limit their behavior? And that would be a little bit more of the type of hedging.
So I have a question about their behavior in a conflict, just to follow up there. There's something that's really puzzling to me in all of this. On the one hand, the model says that non-nuclear powers have to carefully keep track of the conventional balance of power, and they have to keep track of their own core interest and determine their own red lines. And this all makes sense. Okay? If you're a non-nuclear power and you're going to war with a nuclear bet, you're inherently taking a big risk. No matter how good your red lines are, no matter how much you try to constrain yourself, there's a risk there. And yet in a couple of the examples you made, it sounded like the calculations weren't very precise at all. So in the first one, you said that the Soviet Union was very well aware of U.S. intentions to use nuclear weapons, and presumably watching the U.S. closely. But the U.S. arsenal up to 1948 was pathetic. Yeah. I mean, in terms
even
of
up to 1950.
Even to 1950, it was pathetic. The Soviets had deeply penetrated the Manhattan Project, so presumably they were aware of these limitations, right? Flying a symbolic B-29 to London, big deal, right? We couldn't really use these things in a meaningful way until the 1950s. And the other case you made was even more peculiar, right? Because this was Iraq in 1990. You talked about Saddam Hussein and his buddies sitting around discussing possible U.S. use, but they're modeling a 20-kiloton burst over Baghdad. Now, this is a Hiroshima-type bomb.
Right.
The U.S. arsenal was vast. It was huge. There were gazillions of kilotons available. We weren't going to use something that small if we were going to use it at all. And all of this information was public. There was no secret about this, right, in 1990.
In fact, the U.S. had said, it had leaked, the U.S. did not have intentions to use nuclear weapons.
Yes, but it's really strange that in both cases, it seems like there's this very strange, vague discussion of the enemy's nuclear capabilities. This shouldn't be a vague discussion. There should be a specific discussion about what they have and what they might use, given the risks involved. So I'm just curious, given your research on all of these cases, do non-nuclear states and the leaders of non-nuclear states, are they actually measuring their nuclear rivals' capabilities carefully, or are they treating it as a binary? Either he has them or he doesn't.
From what I have seen, and this is a great point that has come up other places. I got asked once, were they aware of tactical nuclear weapons there? And no, they thought the Pershing missiles were deployed. They weren't with nuclear weapons, right? They were completely missing the situation. I think it's more of a binary. I really do. And why I think that is purely inductive. I don't have a good theoretical story to tell you here. It's purely inductive. The Soviets weren't really paying that close of attention, at least at the top levels, to how many nuclear weapons. There was a sense if it came down to a big war, the U.S. had these, they could keep producing them, we didn't have them, and we would be vulnerable as a result. Even if it took several years, and the U.S. war plans at the time were, this is going to be closer to a World War II style combat that's going to take several years because atomic bombs at that point were not that much more destructive, and they took a much longer time to deliver before ICBMs and thermonuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein, same thing. They were talking about American nuclear capabilities, but they were completely missing any discussion of numbers that I can tell. They talked about Pershing missiles in the region, which just wasn't there as near as I can tell. My sense is, if you were on the receiving end of nuclear strikes, it doesn't matter where they're coming from. The issue is, can we do something to stop them? Is it a missile? Is it a bomb? Is it from a submarine? Is it from a ship? From land? It's just they have them and they can use them. And in the other cases I look at, Egypt, we know that they constantly were bothering the Americans about the Israeli nuclear program, so they were well aware the Israelis had these. Various Egyptian generals in interviews after the fact have said, yeah, we knew we had them, but we figured as long as we stopped 10 miles in to the Sinai, they weren't going to use them. And they communicated that through the United States to the Israelis through back channels. But and there I lack as much evidence, but my sense is they weren't talking very detailed. What do the Israelis? Do they have the Jerichos yet? What are they going to use to, is the F-4s that are coming at us? It was just, we're vulnerable. They can blow up the dam, which would flood entire Upper Egypt. They could come after Cairo. For Saddam, it was, they could take out Baghdad and Basra, and then what's left of Iraq. And for the Soviets, it was, if this is a long campaign, we have no way of dealing with this. So I don't know. Maybe someone could tell me if that invalidates my argument, but that's my sense. And I think this says something to international politics too, more broadly. We like to think, in the United States and other countries, that we'll position a plane here or a ship here, and our intentions of doing this are going to be very clearly picked up, right? We're showing resolve by flying a bomber over North Korea, and they'll know what this means. They'll understand we have these capabilities in this area. I just don't think these, at the top levels, they're going into that fine-grained analysis. It's more, what can they possibly do? We know they have some of this stuff. So a lot of times these signals just get lost in the noise. There's just so much noise out there. You can't pay that close of attention to it at the top levels.
Diane, please.
So thank you, Paul. This has been really interesting. This question may go beyond the scope of your work, but I'm curious, bringing it really to today and ISIS and everything. Obviously, when the civil unrest started in Syria, neither side had nuclear weapons. But as the escalation has occurred, and now Syria finds itself potentially facing a coalition which has several members that have nuclear weapons, is this process of hedging and acting going into the way that they're going to prosecute the war? Assad specifically?
So I guess it would come down to who's Assad prosecuting it against. against. If he's prosecuting against the insurgents, then it's not really. I don't think it's going to really come into play much. If it was the United States suddenly saying we're going to invade you, that would be a danger to a core interest. Your viability as a state. My guess is they probably wouldn't have to hedge much because they're just so weak. They can't do anything to the United States, really. So in this case,
Does it matter that they might have a proxy on the other side of, say, Russia, that also has nuclear weapons?
yeah, I think that they would probably reach out at some point and try to get Russia to in some way commit itself, either publicly or privately, to saying, don't do this, we will cause problems for you elsewhere. And we see this even when it's not with allies. I'll go back to the Egypt case. They reached out to the United States during the 1973 war through back channels to communicate through the U.S. to the Israelis, we're going to stop. And they were constantly trying to get the U.S. to rein in the Israelis. They knew that the one country, Sadat understood at least, the one country that can control the Israelis was the United States. They weren't an Egyptian ally at the time. They technically didn't even have relations, I think, until after the 1973 war. Nasser kicked them all out after 1967. But this was using an external power as sort of a form of hedging, in this sense, to communicate to the Israelis, we're not going further. And then Kissinger said back, he's like, yeah, we told them, you're not going further. And we've made it very clear to them they're not to target civilian targets with this. Private.
Yeah, in the way back, please.
Hi. Well, I'm Tim Zill. I'm from the Center for Presidential History. I'm a postdoc there, and I tell you that because I'm not a political scientist. I think everybody should know that before I unveil my ignorance here.
We're welcome. All historians are welcome.
Well, I just want to make one really quick comment and then ask a question about the literature. So the first comment is that Daniel Harrington, who's the Deputy Command Historian for Strategic Command, has a new book out on Berlin, which makes it even more complicated and interesting for your study because he argues that once the air fleet is organized for the
Can't do an atomic
they
campaign.
can't do the atomic strike. Yeah. So it's just totally amazing that now that capability is rendered effective. But I want to ask you more generally, and I know nuclear weapons are your thing, but what does adding nuclear to this story do? Maybe you can compare that to just tell me. But how is this different than just overwhelming asymmetrical conventional power? Is there something different? Do overwhelmingly strong conventional powers facing off against less strong powers behave differently than in this case that you set out with the nuclear disparity? And if so, why is there a difference? Does it have to do with the untested nature of nuclear weapons, relatively untested? Does that give us more of a normative, make us more rely on normative arguments to understand what's happening? I'll let you do what you will with that.
Sure. No, I mean, it's an excellent question. It's an important question. It's one that I'm still wrestling with. I think the basic logic of when you act is common to big asymmetries in power generally. I actually, in the book, I go back to Clausewitz, right? So I'm talking about how he talks about these big asymmetries in power and how states will behave. And I draw some stuff directly from him, other more conventional deterrence literature, general asymmetric literature of Andrew Mack, who's done, Why the Weak Win Wars, and Ivan Toft. Yeah, TV Paul. So I draw a lot on that. I think what the sort of nuclear component of this is showing how the non-nuclear state factors in the fact that there are nuclear weapons out there. Do they take these into consideration at all? Or do they just ignore them? Or do they think they're completely off the table? And so it adds another layer to asymmetries. And in some cases here, you got to remember, you can have much more conventional parity in some ways. Soviets and the Americans were not sort of asymmetric conventionally, but they were sort of asymmetric nuclearly in nuclear realm. So it's sort of a new way of getting at asymmetries of power. So the story of why it's nuclear is that they do take these into consideration, they do factor them in, but the basic, of dangers to core interests, when you face someone really, really stronger than you, you're not going to go bother them about most things. You're going to do it when it's a big problem. You're probably going to try to hedge in some way. This shows how the nuclear weapons affect that hedging as well. I also, just my last little point, I think that's interesting. I haven't teased it out enough in my head yet to show that there's a lot more continuity with sort of conventional asymmetry than we may think in some ways.
Excuse me. I wanted to kind of piggyback on Dr. Grosvenor's statement about the hedging, kind of being insufficiently supporting the non-nuclear states' core interests. I understand your argument that the hedging to be a best case scenario for the opposition to respond with nuclear weapons. In the case that that is not, if that's not the end result, and the end result is mutually assured or basically destruction of that non-nuclear state, is that also an assessment that if they move forward with an attack, that they're accepting that destruction as an option also? If in fact their net assessment or their hedging is not accurate?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. I mean, it's critical for the argument that there be some non-zero probability that these weapons get used. That's why, going back to Ricky's point, I say it's still a little bit of a gamble at some level. You are taking on some risk of destruction here. What you're trying to do is...
So suicide is an option.
Well, you're not looking to commit suicide. What you're trying to do is, if you're facing death, right, this big challenge where you lose really big security situations, then making a gamble where you might end up dead, it becomes more attractive. But you still, when you're doing that, you put in place policies to try to minimize the chance you end up dead. All right, you're not looking to do
policy.
Yeah. Well, you don't do stupid stuff. It's in this case, it's applicable here as well. Try to do the best you can to deal with a bad situation. This is a bad situation. You've got to fight a nuclear state. This is not something countries want to do if they can avoid it. So make the best of the bad situation.
And then go back.
Thank you, Paul. I wanted you to go back to your Soviet example of between 1945 and 1949, which is when they actually did their first nuclear test. They were building up to it before that, but they actually didn't have it. And as Josh pointed out, we didn't have a whole lot of capability, but we did have some capability, and yet they were very aggressive during that 4-year period in taking over Central Eastern Europe. And they didn't seem to be hedging a whole lot about that.
No, so right. They didn't get the bomb until 1949, August 1949. Is when they detonated there. Stalin was very nervous. He made them tell them twice that they in fact did do it. And then he asked if it was as good as the Americans. So that's why this is part of this. This is the period of atomic monopoly. Why were they behaving the way they were in Eastern Europe? This was their core security issue. Right? This is. You can go back all of the meetings with the Western powers at Tehran, at Yalta, at Potsdam, over and over and over. Stalin's telling the Americans, Poland, it may be an issue for you. It's life and death for us. Right? He says this phrase a couple different times. Other Soviets are pretty consistent with this. Some of the Soviets who, Litvinov, who was generally viewed as somewhat pro-Western, was writing policy papers at this time saying, we essentially have to have a security zone in Eastern Europe. And this is one of the pro-Western guys. Right? So there's a really compelling strategic logic here for the Soviet Union and during World War II and right after World War II to get this defense in depth, given what's happened to Russia the last 20, 30 years. It wasn't nice for those people. I'm not saying this was morally good. It was terrible, right? But this was the thinking. Now, why weren't they hedging that much with the United States? In large part, I think the Americans said it's not worth us fighting for Eastern Europe. By Potsdam, the Poland issue had essentially been settled, and it was, we know the Soviets are going to dominate it in ways very different than what we would like to see as true independence on their part. And it was sort of similar that the United States wasn't going to fight a war over Bulgaria or Romania or a few other countries. And a couple times Americans on the ground in those countries started protesting some of the Soviet actions a little too much, and the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Jim Burns, cabled and said, guys, dial it down. All right? This is not going to be an issue we're going to fight over. We're going to secure Western Europe. We're going to secure Japan, and that's what we care about as being necessary to our security.
Jim, next.
Do you have a follow-up question?
I
I just have one quick question.
Sure.
Why is this not the non-nuclear state accepting suicide and mitigating that with hedging? Why is it hedging and not necessarily suicide?
Okay, say a little bit. Okay,
So
I'm going to follow the line here.
it seems as if that the non-nuclear state is taking an action to protect their core interests, but they're doing so at their detriment, which is destruction. But your argument is saying that they hedge to protect their interest, and it seems to me that it's almost a mitigation of destruction. Like if we do this, the likelihood is that we can be destroyed. But let's try to give a best effort to mitigate that by by a hedging process, by diminishing the way by which the nuclear power can respond.
Well, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think we agree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think that what they are trying to do is hedge to minimize the odds that these weapons get used, so they don't commit suicide, and that's sort of the basic logic.
Okay, I think I'm just kind of clarifying how I'm understanding your argument.
Okay, I think we're in agreement. I don't know if anybody.
You said you liked methods.
Yes.
I have a methodological question. I haven't read your manuscript, but I will.
Wait until it's done first.
Yeah, well, I know you're working on it. How many cases do you have? This would be the first question in terms of the design here. And the main part of my question is, can you tell us about the hard cases and the easy cases? So what you're looking at, are these easy cases or hard cases? So if you can array the cases that you have, and I'd be curious to know what the universe is here of cases, because this is a pretty finite. We only had nuclear weapons since the 40s, so you can count almost every instance, right, that this has happened since the 1940s.
Every instance of a war. Crises, we get into a couple hundred.
A couple hundred crises, so potentially, a couple hundred crisis cases. How many war cases?
Whatever that number. About 12, I think. This is the Universe of Wars, Correlates of War data set.
Okay, so about 12 cases. But looking at those 12 cases,
12 to
what are the hard ones and what are the easy ones for your argument? So, I mean, if you're really going to be certain that you've got something here, you can't just look at the easy cases.
So to answer your first question, how many in-depth cases do I do? 4. Right? Now within that, I have a lot of observations. So I have numerous cases of the Soviets backing down, and a couple cases of the Soviets acting assertively. With Egypt, right, 1967, when Israel got the bomb, to 1979, I have a couple Egyptian, the War of Attrition. I have the War of 1973. I have a couple other crises, and then I have periods where the Egyptians tried diplomatic overtures, both 67 to 73, and then obviously after 73. So there's multiple observations thinking about it that way within each case. I looked briefly here for a number of different reasons. Generally, most of these have sort of core interest by the non-nuclear side being threatened. Argentina poses a little bit, that poses a little bit of a problem for this. There was real danger to their state collapsing at that, well, not collapsing, but there was real problems domestically, but it wasn't like you could blame Britain for it. So I think this was a diversion. If any war gets held up as a diversionary war, that's the one that gets held up as a diversionary war. How do I classify these as hard and easy? There's a lot of different ways you can look at this. Since my main sort of foil are the nuclear taboo arguments, what are the hardest cases for me given what they would predict? Are basically the Egyptian-Israeli ones and the Iraq-US one, especially the Iraq-US one. This is 45 years of no use. The U.S. took defeats in Vietnam, right? Didn't use these in Korea, settled for a stalemate. Pretty clear the U.S. has a fairly high bar for using these weapons. Maybe there's some moral reason we're not using these weapons in a lot of these situations. U.S. has no direct threat to its territory, so there's no survival need to use these weapons in 1991, right? Sometimes survival needs make people violate norms. If you're starving, you might turn to cannibalism, but there's no reason to do that here. This is arguably one of compellence rather than deterrence. Everybody says compellence.
And these
is,
are easy cases.
no, Iraq's hard. So I'm making this is why it's a hard, because it's an easy. I'm sorry, it's an easy case for the taboo people. Easy case for them. So if they should be able to explain that, and if they can't, right? If my argument can come in and show you what's actually going on here, then that's a tougher test, I think. The fact that I think I'm right in 1950 with the Korean War, you wouldn't really expect the taboo to matter much there anyway. So that's an easier test from my side. It's not a very, it's almost an impossibly hard test for the norms.
But I guess I'm also pushing to say, how can you falsify this argument? I mean, what would be, what would show that demonstrate that this is not an accurate argument?
A couple of things, I think. One, if countries were behaving very assertively against nuclear states for just little trivial issues pretty consistently, I don't expect, this is a most likely argument. So the fact that there may be one case that doesn't conform is actually probably good because it shows that the argument can be shown wrong. So if Argentina doesn't work for me but the rest do, great. That's, I can't explain every case, but that means the argument's at least falsifiable here. If you get in and they're not talking about nuclear weapons at all, like if I had gone into the Iraq case and nobody mentioned it, that would be a problem for this argument because there'd be no evidence that they were actually hedging in any way, no evidence that they cared about this in any way. But consistently throughout, there's people are talking about it in different cases. So I guess if there was no discussion, that would falsify the argument as well.
Would it help you to divide these cases up somehow, somewhere, so hard and easy, and show how would that bolster your argument?
In the manuscript, one of the things I try to do is say, the main foil is the taboo. These are the easy cases for them. Okay. So if I can explain these and they can't, and I can also explain these other cases like China in 1950, then all else equal, my argument's probably superior. I did not do that in the talk, but maybe that's something that I should do and say, the Iraq case is a really easy one for the other guys. It should be kind of hard for me in some ways because we wouldn't expect nuclear weapons to matter as much in these situations to begin with. If Iraq's still taking them into consideration, then it shows there's something there for this.
Well, a hard case might be one where the nuclear power has very little nuclear capability, right? Like in the 48 case.
Yeah.
And yet, if the Soviets are still freaking out about that and still hedging operationally because of that would support your case quite strongly.
So all my cases are hard cases. That's great. That's the best research design you can do.
How you sell a book. I think we have time for one last question to give.
Well, I think it just got answered.
Two more questions.
I was looking at the write-up that said you were on a book project that explored why states without nuclear weapons challenge and resist. Aside from Egypt and the Iraq I think you answered some of, there are some non-nuclear states that have taken a risk by challenging a nuclear state, but we don't see that very often, do we?
No, and I wouldn't expect you to see it that often. If we saw it all the time, then it probably would mean that it's not states are getting into fights for things that are less than dangerous to their really core issues. So if they are taking off some of the reasons they're going to fight, if they're constricting it to only cases where there's a really big threat to them, to the non-nuclear side, we'd expect the sort of number of conflicts to go down a little bit. And I think we actually, do I still have that on the... yeah, so 45 to, oh no, I want to do the 1990. Is this the 1990? There's two screens on here, so I get confused which one's which. Yeah, so percentage of confrontations, they are acting more carefully once one side gets a nuclear weapon. This is when, before one side gets a nuclear weapon, they're more willing to push a little further. Once one side gets it, that number gets cut about in half, and the number of confrontations that actually escalate and become a war. When both sides have it, very, very rare. But that's outside the scope of my argument. That's sort of, I would just say Matt's right.
So does that confirm all of Ken Waltz's
this
arguments? Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it confirms it.
For the non, for the ones in the room who don't know who Ken Waltz is and what I'm saying, could you explain that? Just maybe explain that too.
Well, tragically just passed away last spring, or 2 springs ago now, spring of 2013.
He's one of the great scholars.
Yeah. So his argument is essentially that when both sides have nuclear weapons, they're both going to realize they can destroy each other, or at least lose a few cities. When you lose a few cities, it's not worth fighting. There's no political goal worth the destruction of a few of your cities. And so you're going to get peace when 2 countries have nuclear weapons facing off against each other. They're not going to fight. Waltz takes this to its logical extreme. He says, let's give everybody nuclear weapons. And then he doesn't say everybody. But he said, let's give Iran nuclear weapons.
He told me personally that Muammar Gaddafi should have nuclear weapons.
Well, he was not, he's a third image guy. State type doesn't matter. Deterrence works. So for Waltz, if most countries had nuclear weapons, you'd have a much more stable world.
If Waltz was here, he'd probably say, look at Libya today.
Yeah.
It's a country that's been totally destroyed and it's in complete chaos. Exactly. One more question, sorry, Chris.
You talked about this a little bit with Egypt, but I'm interested in how much you observe the non-nuclear states signaling its hedging. Whether it's just keeping that private and hoping it's right, or whether it's actively trying to sort of communicate to the nuclear power that it is constraining itself.
I give a test to all the students about signaling hedging, what that means.
A lot of words in there. I don't find a lot, which I admitted probably be better if I did see them communicating or trying to communicate this overtly more. But I'm not going to make up evidence. So
That's good.
No, I can tell that that a lot of times they would try to get outside actors on their side, but it was not done, transparently. The Egyptian case is, I think, the only one where it was clearly communicated to the other side at the start that we're not going to go that much further. I think in most cases it's a little bit more of a gamble than that they're sort of pushing not that far and hoping the other side figures it out. That as long as they behave in a somewhat restrained way, it's signaling that they're not going to do more. During the conflict itself.
Great. Thank you very much. Terrific questions and terrific talk. Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone very much.
Get some more cookies and coffee and tea and Cokes if you'd like before you leave.